Now for something completely different. This is Bankstown Generations. Please welcome a man whose face you may have seen around the place, Dr. Bryan Brown, AO, and Sarah Mansour from the Bankstown Poetry Slam, and our moderator, welcome him back again from last year, Bilal Hafda, from now the Sydney Story Factory.
So I can't say I'm a big fan of having to start right when morning tea is supposed to start. So can you all do me a favour? Anyone who has a pen in front of them or a pen in their hand, can I get you to get your pen and hold it up in the sky for me? Everyone. Really high? Perfect. So if at any point in time I start talking too much, I want you to get that pen and throw it at me. Please. Because my responsibility today is not to speak, it is to listen, and I don't think I can think of two better people to have the opportunity to listen to. And some of the discussions today have been around culture capital and human capital, and I think you'll be very hard-pressed to find people who are worth more than the fabulous Bryan Brown and Sarah Mansour. So I will introduce them. Bryan, actor, producer, doctor, all-round fantastic human being. Please give Bryan a round of applause for coming along today. And Sarah Mansour, co-founder of the Bankstown Poetry Slam, the largest poetry slam in Australia, lawyer, connoisseur of all things Nutella, good friend of mine. So if you need to consult her for recipes, please be sure to do that. I'm going to start off with a relatively simple but possibly strange question. Why today, for this talk, are we talking about Bankstown? Why are you two sitting here, and why am I asking you questions about Bankstown? Why is Bankstown important? So either of you who wants to start, you're more than welcome. Why are we talking about Bankstown?
Chris Brown asked me to. And because Bankstown, I guess, has a huge part to play in both our lives. I grew up there from 1953 in the Bankstown area, lived at Panania in a housing commission house, learned everything I needed to know about how to get on in the world, how to exist in the world, how to treat the world from that area. So I guess that's why Chris asked me here.
Yeah, and I'm also here, I suppose, for similar reasons. I grew up in Punchbowl and a little bit in Bankstown as well, but definitely in that region. At the time that I was growing up, it was already a very, very diverse area, and it's diversified even more over the years, over the last 25 years. And it's a really good example of how multicultural Australia can work in such a really fantastic, cohesive way.
Frankly, I'm offended at how eloquent you are, so now I have to up my game and be more eloquent. But thank you so much for those responses. My next question has to do with you mentioning that both of you have grown up in Bankstown, and I'm kind of curious to see, for you, how has Bankstown changed from when you were growing up in Western Sydney compared to how it is now? And also, where do you think Bankstown is headed? Where do you think Bankstown is headed?
Well, I should go first on this, shouldn't I?
Yep.
When I think of my growing up, I think of neighbours, I think of swamps, I think of church, I think of learning how to survive in many ways on a fairly basic level, like who on the street or where on the street might you get in trouble, and how should you handle that? I don't mean there was people running around with guns or knives trying to get you, but you did have bullies. You did have groups of fellas around that could give you a hard time, and you had to learn how to handle that, whether to laugh it off, whether it meant anything. When I grew up, it was Anglo. There was a few Italians and a few Greeks. I'm not even sure there was a Chinese restaurant when I was growing up. I grew up from about 1953. I didn't leave Panania till 1972. But the biggest thing when I say neighbours is that I spent a lot of time in neighbours' places. And that wasn't because I didn't like my own home. My own home gave me an enormous sense of security that I was able to take into the world. I had a single-parent mother who brought up my sister and I. And that house in Panania was a home, and I was always secure there. And that was a wonderful thing to have and to know about. But when I say neighbours, on a Saturday when I was running around, because I'd leave the house in the morning, wouldn't get back in the evening, I'd be fed in one of the houses. When Mum had to go and play piano in the evening somewhere, it wouldn't be back until 7:30 or something, I'd come from school and stay at a neighbour's place and do my homework there, and if Mum wasn't back in time, I'd be fed, as was my sister. People didn't care how we played. They didn't mind if we played football in their backyard. It was sort of like you lived in everybody's house, and it was very community. The rivers were a great source of fun and places to go when it was hot, even though you'd end up with boils the size of footballs on your back. Our push bikes let us be adventurous, and I think that adventurousness that I learnt as a young man growing up, I was able to take out into life, because in 1972, when I decided I wanted to be an actor, and as I was saying to my daughter this morning, who's in the States, I said, you know, when I said I wanted to be an actor, I was an insurance salesman at the time, but I belonged to an amateur theatre. When I said I want to become an actor, or I'm going to become an actor, no one believed me. No one thought, why would a bloke in Panania become an actor? Well, 18 months after I left Panania, I had a year's contract at the National Theatre of Great Britain, the most prestigious theatre company in the world. I bullshitted my way into there. And I learnt that in the West.
I think, Bryan, it's really interesting to see you talking about the connection between being able to be adventurous but also be supported by a community that cares about you and being willing to take that step and coming from that space. And that's really, really interesting. Sara, what is your take on how Bankstown was when you were growing up, what it is now, and where do you think it's headed?
Well, I suppose for me, that idea of adventure was something that also defined my childhood. So this was a time, I mean, I'm not that old, but I suppose we didn't have mobile phones and the internet and computers and stuff like that when I was younger. So you'd have to be imaginative. You'd have to go and get your hands dirty and have fun and go on bikes and learn how to ride and fall down and scratch yourself and break things. And so, yeah, I mean, I had very similar experiences, you know. If there was one time actually where my mum had to go give birth to the third of the 8 children in my family, and I was 5 and my sister was 3, and she had to rush off and my dad was at work, so our neighbour took care of us and fed us za'atar sandwiches and made sure that we were looked after the whole time until she was better and she was able to come home. And really, I mean, I think the innocence of childhood is quite beautiful because you don't really know what the differences are until someone points them out. So I always thought I was an Aussie kid. You know, once there was something playing on the radio and I said, Dad, what's that horrible music? He says, oh, that's the Quran. So I thought that was really funny. I was familiar with Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, not with the Quran. So, yeah, and I suppose I always felt that I really belonged because in Punchbowl and Bankstown, everyone looks different. So when everyone looks different, everyone is kind of part of the same community. And that was kind of the same with Newtown. So I always felt kind of, as a teenager, really comfortable in Newtown as well for those reasons. Like you kind of, all the misfits are together and it's like, yeah, hey, we're part of the same clan. And I suppose the only things that really defined my identity were kind of those really huge national and international moments, like, for example, the 9/11 bombings and the Cronulla riots. Those were two times where I'd have to kind of sit down and think, and I was really young, to question what my identity is and if I'm Australian or Lebanese. And then kind of coming to terms with this concept of a hyphenated identity, of being from there and from there, but and having those things inform how I am, who I am, and what I believe in, but not necessarily having to put a specific label on it. I suppose those experiences helped shape what I'm passionate about and helped kind of further myself in terms of my career and my community work. And that's what that's actually one of the reasons why I really got into spoken word poetry and started performing poetry, and then started the Bankstown Poetry Slam with Ahmed Aradi in 2013. It was just that, we really needed a space to talk about these things and to feel that we do belong and to sort of assert our identity in a way. So Bankstown's really transformed in a sense for me, because now we have this poetry community which is there every month, and we talk about all the topical issues, or we just talk about love, or we talk about whatever we want to talk about. But as young people, I think that's so important. And moving forward, I hope that that space continues to thrive, but more spaces in Western Sydney take Bankstown Poetry Slam as a model, and whether it's writing workshops or theatre shows or whatever it is, I think that need for young people to have a space to express themselves artistically is so important.
And it's such an amazing resource what you're talking about, not only in terms of the content that gets generated, but that ability to be able to talk with it with audiences who are listening to you and engaging with you in the moment. And I think that's fantastic to have. One of the things I want to talk about while we have everyone here and while we have you on stage is some dangers for Bankstown. And I think moving forward, and we are looking towards the future, when I say dangers, I mean to do with decisions that are made about Bankstown, possibly from people who aren't from Bankstown, or even decisions that are made inside of Bankstown that are not benefiting it, that are affecting it for the worst. So what do you think are some things that we need to be concerned about in conceiving of Bankstown and decisions that get made about kind of Canterbury, Bankstown area? And this is to either of you, whoever wants to kind of think about it first. What are some dangers for us?
I sort of got dragged back into Bankstown because I don't live in the area anymore. I moved way away from Bankstown, but I made sure that I stayed on the left-hand side of the bridge, or the western side of the bridge. I couldn't actually live on the other side. There's a whole part of me that just won't do it. And I'm really glad that guy sits in there. No, I live at Balmain Way. But the thing, I got a phone call from a young Lebanese Australian girl about 6 years ago, and said she wanted to do a Lebanese film festival. And I think it was Daryl Menem was one of the ministers in the Bankstown area for the time, and the young lady came from Bankstown. And she said she wanted to do a Lebanese film festival, and he'd said, well, you need to get someone from the industry involved. And he said, Bryan Brown is an old Westie, get onto him and see if he'll help you. Well, this young lady and her sister and brother-in-law got onto me, lassoed me, wouldn't let go, and 6 years later I'm still the patron of the Lebanese Film Festival. But it did open my eyes to the West that I'd left. And made me sort of think about it and look at it. And around the same time, and I loved their enthusiasm, I loved their intelligence, I loved their clarity, I loved their commitment to what they wanted to do. And I had to ask myself, was that sort of thing going on when I grew up in the West? And then, not more than a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to meet Sarah and get to see the Poetry Slam. And sitting in there watching these young Western Sydney people expressing their hopes, their joys, their struggles, their dreams, their desires in such an intelligent, clear, creative way once again made me go, nothing like that was happening when I grew up in the West. When I grew up, I didn't know a single person who had been to university or was going to university during my time of growing up. And here in these two simple situations, I was meeting young people who were very bright, very well educated, tertiary education, and I found it quite thrilling to think that that sort of growth happens. The West, when I was growing up, was sort of looked down upon. A bit, you know. I don't have any sort of chip from it, but I know that when I remember going to a bar once when I was about 23, and there was a very cool-looking girl in there, and I started chatting her up. And she asked me where I came from, and I said, Paddington. Because I figured I had a better chance than saying Panania. I didn't get her. But there was a feeling that you were this place that was away from Sydney. You know, like you were disconnected to the real world. You're sort of a bunch of people running around not knowing what you're doing. Well, when I look at Sarah and I look at the other young people that I've come across, they know exactly what they're doing. So what should happen, do I think? Just keep getting more of them. Just keep giving the chance for more of these people to exist in the community and give them what they need, because they'll take Australia forward.
That's a beautiful sentiment. Thank you. I think that growing up, I also was acutely aware of the negative connotations that kind of Bankstown and Punchbowl had, especially, you know, that there was like gangs and there was a bit of violence and stuff like that. And so when I would tell people that I'm from Punchbowl and, you know, they were definitely not from Punchbowl and they wanted to connect with me, they would say, oh yeah, like Trent from Punchy. If you guys remember that video. If you don't remember that video, please jump on YouTube and watch Trent from Punchy. But that was the only way that they could, you know, try and reconcile that gap, that huge gap. And I thought that was really awkward. And I said, oh yeah, sure. But, you know, I think the real danger is that ignorance, and that ignorance, that rhetoric of us versus them, that kind of starts from the top down, you know, from media and politicians and whatever, and then trickles down. And I think the most dangerous thing is when people in the Bankstown community think of themselves as separate to other people in the Australian community. And that divisiveness is what's really dangerous, because when you feel like you're a young person, especially, and you don't belong and you need somewhere to belong, well, you're going to look for it and you're going to look for it in the wrong places. So I think it's really important that there are checks and balances in place to ensure that, you know, when we're talking about these really sensitive issues, we're doing it in a way that's quite pragmatic. And there's maybe, you know, more of a focus on making sure that people that further that rhetoric, whether they're politicians or you know, ex-politicians or whatever it is, that there are ramifications for those words, because they go a really long way in creating that atmosphere that's quite dangerous. So yeah.
Thank you guys very much. I'm very conscious that we're running over time, so the only thing that I wanted to mention just to wrap up is, if I have anything to add, is having those young people that you're talking about who feel as if they are separate or other or not part of these conversations, having them here in the room, in this room, is absolutely necessary. And the fact that we have Granville boys sitting over there, a mad shout out to Granville boys, the fact that you guys are sitting here and engaging in these conversations, I would love to one day hear from you up here on stage. Would be fantastic. Shameless plug. 29th of May, Bankstown Poetry Slam. If you want to see any of the performances that we have been talking about, young people sharing their stories, sharing their experiences, last Tuesday of every single month at the Bankstown Arts Centre. Thank you guys so much for having us, and a big round of applause to Bryan and Sarah.
So I'd like to be the first to thank Sarah and Bryan for sharing their stories of Bankstown, and for Bilal for leading the conversation and sharing his own experience of Bankstown too. My name's Catherine, and I was born and raised in the Bankstown area. And seeing it change and evolve has been a delight and pleasure. I've seen Bankstown Square transform into Centro. I've seen the library transform from an almost subterranean building into a lovely glass building combined with the Bryan Brown Theatre. I've seen train times on the weekends transform from half hour to 15 minutes. And even the news of the Bankstown CBD is welcoming another campus. Western Sydney University is welcoming a new campus into Bankstown CBD, which will be welcoming 7,000 new students. Even if the infrastructure didn't initially reflect it then, the community has always been vibrant and rich. And I think Sarah and Bryan has really touched upon how important family is in the community of Bankstown. Bankstown Poetry Slam is a reflection of this as well. Sarah was shocked to hear I'd never heard of them when I first went there last year. And I was too, because it embodies what Bankstown is: passionate and proud, a mix and celebration of different cultures and backgrounds, and a showcase of the talent that Western Sydney has to offer. The community is rich, diverse, passionate and proud, and the three individuals, unfortunately I think Bryan has already left, but Sarah and Bilal and Bryan are the very embodiment of what Bankstown has to offer and the talent that Western Sydney has to offer. So on behalf of the dialogue, I'd like to thank you for sharing your stories of what Bankstown means to you.